Hello, we are live.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 2 of Race Talk. I am co host Darnell Benson, and next to me is.
Michael Rainwater. Sorry, I realize I'm on your side. Mr. Wheeler is below us tonight. Hey, everybody, we are live.
We want to welcome you
Hey
to our
guys, welcome
second
to episode
episode.
2
We are
of
looking
Race
forward
Talk.
to
I
continuing to
am
grow
co-host.
together. I want to start off with first apologizing again for some of the technical difficulties that we have experienced that we're continuing to work on and some of the other transitions. But we appreciate your patience, and we have a lot of good information that we look forward to doing tonight. Just want to first start off by asking my co-host Willer, where are you hosting at tonight?
I am in Verona, Kentucky right now. I am at my aunt and uncle's house here because I'm kind of making my way. For those of you who don't know, I live in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a teacher up in Brooklyn, New York. Well, I'm a teacher in Lower Manhattan, but I live in Brooklyn, and I'm visiting family during the COVID quarantine through the Midwest. So I was in Indianapolis last show. This show I'm in Kentucky.
And then our producer, Michael Rainwater, he is joining us for the whole extent of our show today. Michael, tell them a little bit about yourself, please.
Well, I have a little bit of an eclectic background. I spent the first 29 years of my life in San Diego, and then I moved to Indiana in 2013. I came here after completing my undergraduate degree at San Diego State in sociology and music. And then I finished while in Indiana and while teaching a master's degree in special education. So hopefully I can bring a little bit of a sociological perspective on the discussion tonight.
And he is our technology genius, even more. And so we could not be able to function on the show correctly if we did not have Michael. So we're so thankful for him. So you'll see him many times through the show today, hosting and also doing his producing stuff. He's awesome
Looking
multitask.
around and bending
Yeah.
down. I'm turning things on, turning things off, so don't mind me.
I tell you, if we were having our production meeting earlier this week, sometimes it's hard to kind of keep up because Michael's fingers move so fast on that keyboard as things were being presented. So we are so thankful for him. So just want to give you a rundown on what we're going to deal with on today's show. We're going to talk about some of the events of the week. We're going to talk about where do we go from here when dealing with race and some of the problems within it and the solutions to start the healing. And then we're going to talk about how we can discuss with our kids, with other family, with friends, with people of other races about the issue of race. But first, I want to turn it over to my co host, Willer, to begin our discussion with events of the week. Willer?
Thank you, Darnell. So first off, I want to talk about some of the positive things that have been going on, the protest, some of these racist statues coming down, the Confederate flag as well, things that I'm excited about. And it reminds me of something I read in the book. I forget which book it was, but it was very poignant. It was talking about being anti-racist. And I think we see a lot of that right now of not being passive anymore, being anti-racist, which is really important. And let me explain to you why that is important. So the analogy is this: we're all on this conveyor belt, right? And we're moving in a certain direction, right? And let's say just 5% of us, just 5% of the people on the conveyor belt are vocally racist, right? Just the 5%, right? Out of the entire population. Here's what happens when you don't speak up and when you are not actively anti-racist. You might not be racist, right? But we're all still moving on that conveyor belt going the same direction. So when that 5% is actively anti or actively racist, when you don't say anything, that is also a form of racism in the sense that you're moving the same direction they are. You're not doing anything to stop it, right? You might not be racist, but the silence of people right now is it's not something that we can do anymore, because we don't want to be moving on that same conveyor belt as those 5%, right? Because that 5% will quickly turn into 10% to 20%. It's important that we walk against that conveyor belt. We become anti-racist, and we walk against that conveyor belt until there's so many of us walking against that conveyor belt and not just moving with it, that the conveyor belt changes direction, right? And we have more people being anti-racist and changing the way things are than we do people just being complicit, complacent, and standing on that conveyor belt with those vocal racists and moving in the same direction. So that's what I'm seeing a lot of right now. We all are, with the taking down of statues. I know that they actually beheaded one of a Columbus statue, and I forget which state it was. And not that I'm an advocate of violence or I'm an advocate of anything like that, but what I'm seeing is all these states are seeing the importance of taking down these racist symbols, and they're taking it upon themselves to remove them when they see action being taken place by the citizens. And that's why it's so important for citizens to rally around this cause and to be vocal, because it's working, right? It's working. NASCAR has banned the Confederate flag, and people talk about, well, what about the history? What about the history? What about the history? Well, that's the same reason that Saddam Hussein's statue was taken down. I'm not going to forget who Saddam Hussein was. I don't need to see a statue to remember who he was or the awful things he did. That's why we don't see any Nazi flags in Germany. We don't need those reminders around, because when they're there, they're not just reminders, but it's like they are condoning it in a sense, right? So it's not that we're going to lose history, but these symbols of racism, these symbols of oppression, coming down, I think, is a great move on swaying or reversing that conveyor belt, right? That I was talking about.
Yeah. Let's start with that Confederate flag, as many people call it the Confederate flag, but it's really the Confederate battle flag. The problem a lot with our country is we get behind things that we don't necessarily do our research on, that we don't necessarily know the history about. And so many who have the Confederate battle flag think that it was the actual flag that was used for the Confederacy for the 4 years that it was in existence. And that's just not the case. This was something that was adopted later on. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
About how it was later on?
Yes.
Yeah. So what my understanding was that it was around for I think 4 to 5 years, and I don't know a whole lot about it actually, but I do know that it was adopted in the sense that it was more of a form of oppression, more of a form of symbol of the oppression that the South. Let me be. I don't want to say anything that I'm not fully schooled on, but more of a symbol of that the ideology of the South at the time. Correct?
So the first actual flag that they used for the Confederacy as a nation was actually called the Stars and Bars. And for the Stars and Bars, it's where it was very similar to the first United States flag that was there. So I'm going to just put this up for a second for us to actually talk about. And so people are really confused as to which thing they're really supporting. So let me hit that here. Let's see. Go away there. Okay, so this particular first one that says Stars and Bars, first national flag of the Confederacy, 1861. That's actually what the nation of the Confederates in the South had actually adopted first. And it was then later on, way down the line, that what we see here at the bottom, the Confederate flag or the battle flag. So here's another example. Many people don't understand the history of that Confederate battle flag. The reason why it was used, when they were using the first flag that I showed, that flag was being confused when the North and South were going against each other. So you actually had other Confederates who were killing other Confederates because the United States flag at that time and the Confederacy flag were so similar. So therefore, many of the different regiments, as what you see here on the screen now, adopted their own different flags. You had many in the Confederacy who took the battle flag for their regiments, but then you have places like the Mississippi Regiment who have that up top with the stars crossed. The Bonnie Blue there. You see Tennessee's Irish Regiment, the battle flag they took. So people don't really have the education to really know where that flag actually came from. And then once the Reconstruction happened after the Civil War, then that's when the actual battle flag was more prominent, where it was put in windows and things to say to the North, who was there occupying during Reconstruction, that, hey, we don't like big government coming telling us how to live our Southern life. We don't appreciate this, to where the Northern government had to actually then ban those flags during that time.
So in essence, I didn't actually, Darnell, I didn't know all that either. So in essence, what you were saying is that it was adopted as an ideology that perpetuated racist stigmas, right?
Correct. As a matter of fact, once the Northern troops had left after the Civil War during the Reconstruction, they were there to make sure that the freedoms that had been won for the African Americans will be in place and be enforced by the South. And so that's how we had the first Black governor during that time. That's how we had the first Black representatives and others who were in the government during that time, and mayors. But once the Northern troops left, then those battle flags became prominent and were placed again many places, as they then were throwing out any Black leaders and actually moving out any families that were Black who were owning land that they had been given during that time. So it's a symbol of oppression that started back during that time, that many people take pride in, but didn't know the history behind it. So it has nothing to do with the Confederacy as a nation. The Confederacy as a nation never adopted that flag. It was taken by troops, and not all the troops at that, to make sure they could distinguish between each other from a distance and not kill each other.
That's really interesting. So in essence, it also became like a warning symbol to people of color as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I remember the story comes to mind. I remember I was with some of my friends here in Kentucky who were Black, African American, and we stopped off at a gas station in a really rural part of Kentucky. I'm not sure where it was. And they've done well for themselves. They drive nice vehicles. And so one of the ladies or the owners was commenting about how, she doesn't even have a vehicle that nice and blah, blah, blah. And she was, and it was, why would you? My friends, they worked really hard for the things that they had. So it came off a bit like, you shouldn't have this if I don't have this kind of thing, right? But the interesting part was in the window. My friend pointed out, he said, "You see that sign in the window there?" And I said, "What does it say?" He goes, we serve or we sell fresh watermelon." And I said, "Okay." And he goes, "That is a sign saying that no Blacks are allowed." And I didn't know that. He told me that is a warning saying no Blacks are allowed in here. And this was in the 2000s, early 2000s, like 2001, 2002. So, so that is.
Yeah, for me, I'm a peacekeeper as much as possible. I don't like for people to not have peace when I'm around. So I'm very aware of things that I know might irritate, might aggravate, might offend. And if I'm not, then I definitely want to be told so I can correct that. And so, just as the Nazi flag is very offensive to everyone, but particularly to the Jews, it's not prominent in places in Germany. The Germans actually despise everything about that. It's in museums because, yeah, we do want to know our history. We want to keep it so that we can make sure that we don't repeat it. But should we glorify it? And I think that's the big problem that we have with that. What about statues, some of these monuments and things that you had mentioned at first that were coming down? What are your thoughts on that?
So my first thought is it's a great form of being anti-racist, right? It's just like the Confederate flag, just like the battle flag. Let's call it what it is. The battle flag is a symbol of oppression, a symbol of racism. These statues that were coming down of slave owners, of even conquistadors who were, who killed and annihilated groups of people because of race. This is a message. I think this is a message saying that we're no longer going to be silent anymore. We're no longer going to have these as our representatives anymore. Again, it's a great move in the right direction, I think, on being anti-racism and saying, we're not on the same conveyor belt together. And now I'm going to let you know that we're not on the same conveyor belt together. So I find a lot of great hope in that. And I know there was, one man was shot. This was in Albuquerque. One man was actually shot when they were taking down the statue of this, I believe he was a Spanish conquistador. I don't know. Correct me, guys, if I'm wrong. But he was actually shot, and then the state came in and decided to take down the statue anyway. So it's great that people are being vocal about this. It's great that people are doing what they're doing. But it's a reminder too that be careful and be safe. We don't want any more violence. We don't want any more people being hurt. And I'm not going to get into the person who shot him because I don't know enough to speak about that person who did the shooting. I do know he was like an ex-council member or something along those lines. But do you guys happen to know anything background on that?
I don't know that story, but I do know that a lot of the Confederate monuments that are around the South, again, it goes back to right after the Reconstruction, which, for those who aren't familiar, the Reconstruction happened after the Civil War. It was going on in the South. So once again, that the Union troops or the Northern troops had left the South and kind of hoped that everything had been established right and order will be maintained, is when these statues and monuments actually first started being put up. And it was, again, used in an oppressive way to say pretty much to the African Americans who are there and to shove it to the North and say, hey, you may have won this, but our pride is still here and we still glorify these leaders, even though these leaders were fighting on the wrong side of history. And so when we say that we don't want monuments of people like that up, hey, it's fine to have, again, these statues and things of them. But why would we want to glorify someone who was dividing the nation? Why do we want to glorify someone who looked at people like me and didn't see me as an equal? History is one thing. We need to always know our history. When I see people say on Facebook and other things, why can't we just forget the past and move on? Oh, that's a big mistake. We should never do that. But do I need to glorify those of the past that didn't add to this nation in a positive way, but instead try to take the nation down? Hitler, we should always know about Hitler. as the world because of what he did in the world. But should we have statues glorifying him other places and monuments and things like that? Absolutely not. And so that's the thing with this. Why defend something that is a sign of oppression and division? But let's also be straight here. Let's let the government be in charge on taking these monuments down. Let's not add on to any more loss of life or injury. Let's get the right legislation, whatever we need to do to get these things taken down and move them to nice Confederate museums or Civil War museums and things like that, in which they can be explained and not glorified.
Yeah, I think from the sociological perspective and just from a general perspective, I mean, you Google the definition of the word monument. I just pulled it up while you were talking because I think, one of the things that we underestimate is the power of language, and it's used very much to the detriment of many underrepresented groups. And the word monument itself, if you go and you look it up, the general beginning definition is a statue, building, or other structure erected to commemorate a famous or notable person or event. But then you go through and you read down and you get down a little bit further, and one of the alternate definitions is an outstanding, enduring, and memorable example of something. And in fact, the etymology of the word, it comes from Middle English, denoting a burial place, and then from French, originally from Latin, from monumentum, and that the root moner means to remind. So I think, when you're putting up these statues in public places, the statues we put in our public arenas should be physically, literally, and metaphorically representations of the values that we want to lift on high for everyone to see and aspire to. I mean, that's the purpose of a monument in a public arena. It's erected to remind everybody of a great figure who did great things. Oftentimes, these great figures have done some bad things, but you really have to understand that in the greater context, it makes no sense from a societal standpoint to remind every individual in a public space of people who held ideals that run counter to the integration and the happy coexistence of all members of our society. It makes no sense to put up things that literally represent divisiveness in our past that, no, we can't bury. You can't forget it, because the things you forget, you're doomed to repeat. And, these things we did in our past, they were mistakes. It was wrong to subjugate people based on the color of their skin, period. Science has proven this. I mean, at the end of the day, you go and you look at the science on the color of your skin, it's just pigment. It's a degree of pigment.
Right.
Either you are producing more pigment, more melanin in your cells, or less. So you have darker or lighter skin. And it was just a physical adaptation in response to the latitude in which you were living for isolation for thousands of years of human development. It has nothing to do with mental aptitude, physical aptitude. Everybody of every color has different levels of abilities. And when we erect these monuments and these statues that represent people who held ideals that someone was better than another because of an external characteristic that serves no purpose for us to judge the content of their character, it does an injustice to the social progress we're trying to achieve as a collective group. And I think you're right. I think you have to do these things through appropriate channels. People are righteously angry. I mean, they have a right to be angry right now in the streets, here and there, making their voice heard.
Right.
But being angry doesn't give you a right to hurt somebody else. That's where you have a line that has to be drawn very clearly, because people are getting hurt on both sides. And that's not helping. At the end of the day, if we seek to achieve cohesion, healing, and unity, we have to come together and really evaluate our past decisions. What was putting this statue of this person up who we have public evidence that they were very inflammatory, very hateful in terms of their actions. I mean, this isn't like, we're going to spin the tweet that the president made this week on CNN one way and Fox News the other. I mean, this was literal photographs, documented evidence from primary sources of these individuals encouraging other individuals to drag people by ropes through the street until they died in public view. I mean, brutal things that we as a society at our level of development with technology where it's heading to, and population density getting to the level that it's at, I mean, we're not going to come together and survive as a global species if we can't figure out these mistakes as a group, agree that they're mistakes, and then work on how we move forward to create a better daily society for everybody. It's not just about what's sitting in a public square. It's about how we treat each other every single day.
Exactly. So that's a good transition on to the problems that we were having, and one incident in particular this week still with Rayshard Brooks and the death that happened with him, and the actions that led up to that. Willard, can you give us any type of info on that?
Yeah, I watched that video more times than I cared to, and if you haven't heard already, that they have brought felony charges against the officer who shot Rayshard or Mr. Brooks in the back twice, and also charged the other officer that was with him as well. It's the first time in history too that the other officer, not the officer who shot Rayshard Brooks, but the officer that was with him. It's the first time that police have ever cooperated with the prosecutors to testify or help out against another police officer. So that's pretty groundbreaking in and of itself. And they're asking for them to turn themselves in by 6 o'clock on the 16th, I think, something along those lines. But so the video goes like this, and this is why it's so disturbing, is because for 41 minutes, the officer and Mr. Brooks are talking, right? And it's cordial, you know. Mr. Brooks says, you know, listen, I'll walk to my sister's place. That's just right over here. You know, I'll get up and go. You know, you're not gonna have any problems with me. Just let me go. And I believe that the following day was actually his daughter's birthday. So I'm sure that was also in the back of his head. You know, like, I don't want to miss my daughter's birthday. You know, so they give him all the sobriety.
So you're saying he failed a field sobriety test, and that's why he was wanting to walk to his sister's house, because he couldn't drive.
Right. Yeah. So because I don't know which one came first. I don't know if he asked to leave first or he failed the field sobriety test first or not. But I do know that he asked very politely to walk to his sister's place. They patted him down. Right. He had no weapons on him whatsoever. No weapons. No deadly weapons on him whatsoever. They turn him around. They don't tell him why he's being arrested. They start to cuff him. He starts to struggle. And he has the altercation with the cop, punches one cop in the face. He takes one of the cop's tasers. He begins to run. Then he turns around, fires. It looks like he fires the taser. And then the cop pulls out the gun and shoots him twice in the back and kills him. So here is the breakdown for me. They knew he did not have a deadly weapon on him. He'd already been frisked. They knew that, right? He was running away. He was shot in the back, right? Obviously, he was no longer a threat. He was shot in the back. He was running from them, not to them. They were not in danger. The cops were not in danger. And there's some more disturbing stuff that I just found out today that happened after he was shot and killed. I used to work as a pretrial officer. You know, I've been around cops a lot when I was younger. They had his car and his license plate. They could have let him run off. He was caught.
Right.
All they have to do is have your license plate, run your license plate. They're going to find out where you live. They're going to find out everything they need to know about you to follow up with you the next day or that same night and arrest you. There was no reason, absolutely zero reason, for him to be shot and killed. And I apologize, I'm blanking on the officer's name. So that's Rayshard Brooks. Yeah, but I'm talking the officers. I forget the officers' names who were involved.
Let's see, Garrett Rolfe.
Rolfe, yeah.
Yeah,
Brent,
the officer. Yeah.
And then the other officer was Devin Brosnan.
That's right. So here's the other disturbing thing, and something that they were charged with. After he was shot and killed, Rolfe is seen kicking his body. He runs up and kicks him. Yeah. After he's already been shot and in the ground, he runs up and kicks the body of Mr. Brooks. The other officer stands on top of his shoulders. Yes. So completely unnecessary. This man it wasn't a threat to begin with. Not to an armed officer who's been trained, who knows what to do when in a situation like this. So they've been brought up on charges for that as well.
I like what Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms there of Atlanta said. She was quoted as saying, "While there may be debate as to whether this was an appropriate use of deadly force, I firmly believe that there is a clear distinction between what you can do and what you should do." And I think that is the big point right there. What can you do, but what should you do? I can take my gun and use it with some person who doesn't have a gun. But what I should do is find another way to de-escalate this situation, to prevent it from leading to a loss of life. And there's an article that I pulled to compare with this. And this happened this year, but it happened in February. And this man by the name of Scott Orvis in York County and Dover Township. I'm not sure what state that actually is.
Oh, Darnell. I'm sorry, 1 second. I apologize, but there's one important thing that I also have to mention with this case.
Go ahead.
They did not, and they're being brought up on charges for this too, because this is what cops are supposed to do. They did not administer any life-saving techniques to Mr. Brooks after he was shot and down, which is what you're supposed to do. Also,
the audio from the body cam said that the officer was heard saying, "I got him," word for word. Those were the 3 words he said, "I got him." And so the only thing that I'm pleased with, I mean, you can't be pleased about anything in a situation like this, but they did announce today that they're charging him with felony murder. And I think, you watch the tape and you see what happened. You can't use the job as a cover for that.
No, you can't, and especially when you have situations like you do here with the Scott Orvis, who had cops called on him because a man had taken his girlfriend and dropped her off there at the house. He was there. He saw that it was a man dropping her off, and he decided to block him from getting out of the driveway. Guy kept trying to get out. He wouldn't let him go. So what he decided to do then was to hit the man, and so cops were called. Cops get there. Orvis is in the house. The girlfriend's in the house. Orvis refuses to open the door for them when they knock and identify themselves. Secondly, the girlfriend decides to go ahead and unlock the door. But the cops still can't get in because now Orvis is holding it closed from the inside, so they can't get in until the police officers eventually force their way through. Once they do, Orvis began resisting attempts to take him into custody. So we have these 2. One is black, our first case there with Mr. Brooks, and then we have Mr. Orvis here, who is white. And so they attempt to take him into custody. What he does, same type of a situation. He grabs the stun gun or the taser that is, from the state trooper who was there. He fires it at the state trooper. It hits the state trooper in the shoulder. He continues to use this taser, deploys it again, and almost hits another trooper in the head. Now, as he's trying to get away from them, they subdue him, take him into custody with his life still intact, and no gunshots, no bullets were used during that time. So for those who say, well, Mr. Brooks shouldn't have resisted arrest and stuff, I completely agree. He should not have resisted arrest, but neither should have Mr. Orvis. The thing is, these cops with Mr. Orvis are the cops that we need, the cops that we want to be serving and protecting us, because they were looking for every possible way to preserve life. And to take this man.
Mr. Orvis was African American?
Mr. Orvis was white.
Oh,
Mr. Orvis was white, and he was drunk. He also smelled, the cops say here, strongly of the alcohol. They found 2 open cans of beer in his vehicle, and found in his home that he had gone through most of the 16 pack besides 4 cans. So you had in Mr. Brooks' case and Mr. Orvis 2 guys who were both drunk, 2 guys who both did some things they shouldn't have done as the cops were dealing with them, but one lost his life, the African American, while the white did not. And so here goes why again we stay so upset, and why people who look like me, why I am afraid every time I get in my vehicle and every time a cop gets behind me, though I have not done anything, don't have warrants, any type of thing like that. But with all many stops that I've had, as you guys heard last week, and all the many stops my brother had and my different friends, we were always worried what's going to happen with us.
yeah, no, I mean, I've heard your stories, and they're disgusting. Especially like, given that I know who you are, and I know you would, I don't know. It's awful. It's awful for anybody, but it really hits home because, like, you're friends of mine and you're friends with Mike, and we know you, and we know what a great person you are. The thing, and then we're going to turn it over to I think Michael next with the statistics.
No, we're not there yet.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna be quiet after this one thing. I'm gonna be quiet after this one thing, because this is what really makes me happy. And the silver lining, I guess, in all this awfulness is, it is really hard for people to be racist now. You will lose your job. You will be called out. You will be made famous for all the wrong or right reasons, right? If you like the guy who was stenciling Black Lives Matters on his own property, right? On his own property, he was stenciling Black Lives Matter, and the black man and the woman and her husband, who were the next door neighbor, said, that's not your property. You don't live there. I know who lives there." Well, he did live there. It was his property. They lied. They called the cops. The cops roll up, recognized this African American, waved to him, and then went on their way. And now this person has, like, they're not doing business. She runs a beauty business, so, like, people have pulled their business from her. Her husband has lost his job. Same thing with the bird watcher lady and
right. In Central Park.
In Central Park, I watched that video today, and I was like, no, you're overreacting. Anyway.
I think
so
this is a lot of what you're seeing. A lot of what we're all seeing is a big shift in society, and it's really revolving around technology. I mean, a lot of things that were hidden for a long time are being captured on film, put on the internet, instantly produced. What used to take an entire team, a movie studio of people, I mean, a single individual can do in an afternoon now. And It really is, it's great, and it's unfortunate. It's going to be painful. It's a painful growing process. I mean, if anybody out there listening has ever been through a growing experience, they tend to be painful. And it's an important thing, because you have to go out of your comfort zone if you're going to change the reality that you're inhabiting. Because the reality you're inhabiting is familiar and comfortable. The sign, when you start to get uncomfortable in conversations that are difficult, when you start to get uncomfortable in situations that are difficult, centered around this concept of trying to change, it's not a bad thing. It needs to be embraced. And I think, it's really unfortunate that some of these individuals are losing, and I know there's a lot of people that are thinking it's losing their livelihood and everything, and I feel that to some degree, but at the same time, it's their fault. I mean, you have to recognize that we are all now more accountable for our individual actions than we've ever been before in history from the public sphere. Because at any moment in time that you're out in public, someone can whip out a camera, record your bad behavior, and everybody else gets to see it. Right. And so I think that, we all as a society need to recognize this fact. Whereas for hundreds, thousands of years, You had courts and systems that relied on slow, painful investigations of evidence and bringing little bits and pieces forward to put a story together to prove someone guilty or innocent. And all these principles were designed before a time when the technology for everybody to see in real time sometimes, but in retrospect and recording, see what actually happened, sometimes from multiple angles. I mean, you get to see the event where for hundreds of years you had to read about the evidence in a newspaper from a journalist. And so I think it presents this situation where everybody is quick to step into their own mental courtroom. Everybody sees what happens. We see the evidence. We're able to see the situation. And it doesn't take long for most people to figure out, like something not right happened here. And
Right.
when you get to this conclusion, it's a painful process of stripping away what's happening at an individual level. There's individual players here, but at a societal level. I mean, how we're responding to this as a group. I mean, some people have completely lost their minds, and I get that. I
Right.
get it. It's just a really, really difficult situation because we all have to recognize the principle that we're innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Despite the fact that everybody can see the event and we all pretty much, most of us, can come to a fairly similar conclusion, you then have to compete with these media companies. There's only 6 now. There are 6 major media networks that control all of the flow of information. And this is pretty much global at this point. I mean, it used to be just the United States, but they're global. And
Right.
you have people in these institutions that have personal motivations, and they seek to use this dissemination of information in a way that advances their personal agendas. So I think we are at a point in society where we have to step back and really look at how we are critically evaluating our sources of information. Because I think one of the biggest problems that we're seeing play out in America and in the world today is the dissemination of really bad or misrepresented information that is not allowing people to make critical judgments on situations. And it leads people to conclusions that have been essentially front loaded for them, have been put into a certain framework, into a social construct for them that allows them to engage in their confirmation bias and keep this whole construct going. This subversive, subliminal racism that has existed in our institutions since slavery was a global phenomenon. I mean, that's what people forget. We get so wrapped up in this idea of the Civil War in America because we're so America-centric in the United States that we forget that slaves were shipped around the world.
Right.
Native American slaves, African American. I mean, they weren't American at the time. That they were Native Americans in the continent. You had Native Africans from their continent being loaded on boats, shipped all over the world to different places that were predominantly Caucasian. I mean, it's the fact of history that were predominantly fair-skinned by comparison, and we're viewing these people as inferior because they were not as culturally developed. And I put that in quotes because their culture was measured from the lens of the Western world. So by the Western standard, they weren't developed, but by their own internal standards, they were years ahead of their time in certain areas. Of native medicine in America, for example, a lot of modern pharmaceuticals we have today came from Native American medicine. It's plants that were extracted and concentrated, and pharmaceuticals companies took them to market and made a lot of money off them. I mean, you've got this situation where we have a very small amount of people that have a lot of power and a lot of control of wealth. And you have to recognize that those people, those individuals that are running the show, so to speak, you can see a lot of them at the G20 summit, the Bilderberg groups, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Bill Gateses of the world. They don't benefit from a unified public. They don't benefit from a critically thinking, well-armed public that polices itself, that can manage itself, that can have these 2 words that are so lacking in our society today: personal responsibility. Because I think you
Yeah,
look at any of these situations you look at with any of these killings, these deaths, any of the officers involved could have taken personal responsibility to shut the situation down, to take the person who was being overzealous out of the equation, to say, you know what, I'm tapping in, you need to step back, you're getting emotional, or to step in away and say, you know what, he's passed out, you need to get up. I mean, these are things where individuals standing by at this point are now allowing things to occur that should not occur. That if people were taking personal responsibility to really become our stewards of our society, we wouldn't have these situations on either side of the fence for the police or for the people that are being killed in the streets. Because if you had accountability within our institutions, the individuals that are committing these acts would not be allowed to not be held accountable. I mean, that's really what we have. We have a systemic issue of accountability where individuals who engage in behaviors that are not in alignment with the majority of our own values and morals. I mean, most people, I think, today agree that killing is wrong. It should only be a last resort of self-defense. It's a pretty easy do unto others as they would do unto you situation. Nobody in their sane mind with the basic value of human life in their heart would ever want to be in a position to have to kill another human being. It should only be if you feel like your life is threatened. And when we allow individuals who use this defense inappropriately to repeat offend and repeat offend and repeat offend and be defended by our institutionalized concept of, well, they're doing a difficult job, so that, you have to stand by them. We have to trust they're making the right decision. We don't. Not when we see it on camera. Not when the evidence is coming out from body cameras. What we need to do is hold individuals accountable. Not all police are bad. Not all criminals are even bad. Some criminals are just committing petty crimes because they had bad experiences in their life and they've come to the conclusion that's the only way that they can make it one way or another. And it's a bad choice. But unless you are threatening another human being with their life, who has a right to take yours?
Well, we're not even allowed here in Indiana and most states, even here on our property, if there was someone who was doing something to us and we were defending ourselves, the moment that they stop the offense and they turn to leave, if we shoot them, we're in trouble. If we shoot them in the back, we're in trouble. We do those things because at that point, we're no longer defending ourselves. There's no need for that, no more threat for that. And there's been plenty of people over the years who have been arrested, tried and convicted that we felt so bad for because they did have someone come on their property and do things they shouldn't have done. But if we as citizens or civilians can't get away with that, then those who decide to take on that definitely unappreciated job of being police officers, because it is an unappreciated job, but so is education. We can keep naming other positions.
I think every job in public service, almost every job in
is
public
unappreciated.
Service.
Yeah, and so.
But that's the nature of it. It's public service.
It's the nature.
If you're in the job to be appreciated, you're not a public servant. You've got an ego issue.
Right.
I mean, this is the thing. I mean, and we talk about giving these people in difficult situations these passes, but I have a different opinion personally. I think when you have individuals that are in positions of power and authority in society, they should be held to the highest of standards. They are the pillars. They're the examples. They're the ones we're supposed to look to in a crisis. I mean, you can't just expect people who are in these positions to just pass everyday situations. I mean, for just because you have a uniform on, just because you're in a classroom, just because you do X, Y, or Z duty, that you should be excused from the high level of standard of only defending your life in a life-threatening situation. And honestly, like at the same token, there has to be this accountability factor when it comes to psychological health. If you are in a very taxing job psychologically, and you're allowed to continue while your mental health deteriorates, whether due to lack of benefits, access to benefits, access to care, or because you just don't go seek it, because you just go further down that deep dark hole and everybody just keeps patting you on the back and nobody stops to question you about it. And so at what point do we stop and say we're enabling and we're no longer walking towards the right direction? Accidents happen. They happen. But not over and over again. Not repeatedly in a predictable pattern of events. Not to the point where most members of society can close their eyes, listen to a news story, and say, well, that guy was probably black and that guy was probably white. And when we get to that point, institutionally, we have a problem. And we really have to be willing to stop and have difficult conversations about what we can do to fix it at all levels. It's an individual problem, it's an institutional problem, and in all of those connections in between, we need to examine how those relationships are being upheld and how the accountability factor is being put into play. Who do we hold accountable? How do we hold these people accountable? When you go to a police station and you go to make a report, and you make a report to another police officer, I mean, try and go file a report against a police officer. I challenge anybody listening to do it. I mean, when I was in sociology as a major in college, we had to do research on how the institutions operate and how they set up, these cultures within them. Because really, what you've got in any institution, whether it be education, whether it be public safety, whether it be law, criminology, they're subcultures of society, and the individuals within them tend to hold certain views and values surrounding the events they deal with on a regular basis. And when we allow people with certain types of values to shoot first and ask questions later, to go straight to the easy defense, time and time again, not one time as an accident, but 18 times you've had someone report something against you. Derek Chauvin, I'm looking at you. 18 times people report against you, and you're still in that same position. In fact, you're being put into a training position. That's an institutional problem. So where do we go from here? What do we do?
So, with that, it goes again with really knowing history and knowing history of the people that you serve.
You have to know how you got here before you can go.
Right. So with African Americans, with Native Americans, and all that, I've promoted different readings before, and again, I just keep promoting this particular book. It is a history book, To Make Our World Anew, Volume 1, History of African Americans to 1880. And then I have a whole book list that I'm going to make available to people later on who ask for it. Some for children, so on and so forth. But you have to understand the people you serve, their history. How did we get to where we're at, to where those views are there? Because it wasn't the views because of all blacks are a bunch of criminals, and because all Native Americans are this way, all Asians are that way, all whites are this way. No, it is, when we talk about this show is about systemic racism, we are really talking about systems that have led to these brainwashed views that we have here in our nation. And I'm just going to real quickly say this, and then I'm going to
actively protect and uphold them.
Right. It's why it's important to make sure that before you share any memes on any social media, any quotes on social media, any videos on social media, that you research them. There's been several things, I don't have time to hit those right now, that have gone on just this week that I've had to go and correct people on. Whether they decide to listen to me or not, I research what I post. It just continues that stigma and those ideals and things like that. We don't want to do that. And then if you do know of someone, whether they are friends or family, whether these people are your heroes, whether they are your political heroes, or whatever the case may be, if they're saying something wrong, then you have to make sure that you speak up. Don't just speak up when they say the things that you like, but speak up when they say the things that are wrong, so that we're not continuing that being the case. So then how do we talk about issues of race, Michael?
Yep. Well, when we talk about issues of race, especially in the context of what's happened in the past, just a few weeks, a lot of emotions are high. There's a lot of tension out there. There's a lot of differing opinions. There's a lot of gray area. When it comes to this concept of what is or isn't racist and what things are supporting or going against racism, this pun is fully intended. It's not black and white. What looks one way to you is going to look different to me. It's going to look different to Wheeler and different to every person listening to this live stream, this recording, because we all bring a different lens to the table. We've all had different experiences in our life that brought us to this moment, to this experience. And when we see something so jarring to our everyday experience, such as a man being murdered in the street in daylight, and everybody's seen it. I mean, it's graphic, it's shocking, it's painful. It stirs emotions to watch somebody die, knowing full well, we just talked about earlier about the idea that human life is valuable. All life is valuable. It matters. And when you want to talk about issues of race, especially today, you can't minimize or devalue the past. I think the biggest mistake people make, and this tends to come more often than not from the privileged perspective, it doesn't have to. We can't just go stereotypical and say everybody who experiences some privilege is going to think like this, but you hear over and over people say, can't we just move on? Can't we just I think, Darnell, you said this earlier, can't we just forget about that, move on? Can't we go to the next thing? And, we've tried that. We've done that. Yeah. We've had the civil rights movement and we moved on. How'd that work out?
Right.
Because you can't move on from actively creating your culture every day. You're doing it every moment. Right now, talking in this segment, we are creating part of our culture. It's not something you move on from. So no, you can't just move on, and you can't minimize or devalue the past and the history and the experiences that families have passed down for hundreds of years. I understand. Yes, logically, you can sit here, look me in the eye, make the statement. Most African Americans today have never experienced being a slave, and I say most because some have. Go and do your research. Don't say that slavery doesn't exist today, because there is a whole lot of human trafficking.
That's a whole nother show, right?
But to say that most people have not experienced slavery, okay, sure, fine. But what about the level of prominence and social access to resources their family has as a result of what's happened for generations? I mean, It was only decades ago that African Americans were granted the right to vote. It wasn't that long ago. And here we are still, you've got people who still hold this belief that skin color creates a structure of hierarchy.
Superior, and that's one of the things that I was thinking about too. It's this whole, I don't think that people understand that when Black Lives Matter, everybody's life will matter then. That but it has to start there. That's why when people say Black Lives Matter, it's important. White lives have always mattered, right? It's not up for debate.
The system, from the evidence, you could make that argument fairly easily.
Yeah. So when Black Lives Matter, when we get to the point where when Black lives actually matter, when they are treated the same systemically than white people, then all lives will matter. But until then, Black lives matter.
Yeah, and I think getting to this point, I've seen so many people try to have this conversation about Black Lives Matter, no, all lives matter, blue lives matter, brown lives matter, and at the end of the day, saying Black Lives Matter is not saying other lives don't matter. And if you've seen the appropriate meme to explain the situation, it's kind of like your friend had just scraped their knee and they're on the ground and they need a Band-Aid. And your other privileged friend walks up behind and goes, what about me? How come I don't get a Band-Aid? Because you're not on the ground with a scraped knee. You don't need the dang Band-Aid. Walk away. Right? So how do we do this? How do we approach this situation, this delicate issue that people are walking around eggshells and defriending people they've known for years? How do we do this? Well, it starts with not being afraid. I think the biggest enemy that we're seeing in the public sphere right now is fear. People are so afraid. They're so afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing, They're afraid that they're going to see something and not know what to do. They're afraid they're going to be the next viral video hit because they got in the wrong place at the wrong time. Listen, personal responsibility. If you're treating everybody the way you want to be treated, you got nothing to be afraid of. So start with that, okay? And once you get to the point where you can kind of recognize there's nothing to be afraid of, start from a point of humility and use that innate human desire to connect to another human being to just be humble and talk to people, just like we're doing right now. And you sit down and you talk, people are going to get upset. So you have to, when you're coming to sit down, recognize there are times when you got to walk away. And that doesn't mean that we can never have a discussion again. It means that, maybe something I did or something you did inadvertently or purposefully triggered something in the other one of us. And if we continue, we're going against the purpose we set out to engage in at the onset of the conversation. So if we truly want to get better, we have to be willing to set time aside to walk away and process some of these difficult emotions that come up during this. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to get angry. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to say the wrong thing. What's not okay is when you keep doing it and perpetuating it out of an ego need to not be wrong. You have to recognize that it takes humility and being humble to know that none of us are perfect. Who here is without sin that can cast the first stone?
Right.
Not a human being alive hasn't made a mistake. So you have to recognize that now that we are at a point in our society, technologically, socially, and connectively at a global level, that we now have the ability to hold each other accountable in more situations of our daily life than we've ever had before in history that we know of.
Absolutely. I mean, and we can even take it back to the civil rights. I mean, when it started to really take off was when people were videotaping, these African Americans being hosed down, and the dogs were getting sicked on them, and all those types of things.
That was the first step, was being able to record the media. Well, then you had the problem of the intermediaries filtering it for so long. You had so many institutions taking that footage and either archiving it and getting rid of it, not showing it in certain neighborhoods, controlling the flow and where it goes. And now we're at a point where our internet infrastructure created kind of a bypass. I mean, you can go and live stream something on Facebook with nobody to stop you in between. And there's good and there's bad to that. There's a lot of things that have been live streamed that have been terrible and tragic. There's a lot of really good things that have been live streamed.
Exactly, there have.
What we have to recognize is this is power. What we have now as a society is power we've never had before. And we either are going to use it to better ourselves, or we're going to use it to just drive each other apart and destroy our social cohesion. And I think what you're seeing in the media is you're seeing a lot of the individuals who benefit from a divided public, seeking to drive the wedge into that division, pry it apart, and really keep people arguing so that we're not solving problems. Because at the end of the day, arguments are not solutions.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, Mike. You're absolutely right, and that's a whole other show, because I read the book, The Lies My Teacher Told Me, which won an anti-racist Pulitzer. We can talk about that later. We do need to wrap up the show because we are over time.
Before we go, when we do that show, we're going to have to show the distortions that have been made on the world map, especially in American historical culture, because it is eye-opening to see how even something so innocent as a map hanging on a wall has been designed to program your perceptions a certain way, to influence your thought on how important your role is in the world as an American citizen.
I've seen. I know what you're talking about. I've seen that. It's really interesting.
You're right. That's a digression. So I'll suffice my section up real quick right here and just say, at the end of the day, how do we approach this together? That's the simplest way I can put it. We come together, we put all of our judgments aside, we recognize that we might need space to process emotions, and then we unapologetically break down these difficult things. We confront these truths and we accept that, you know what, I may have been a part of contributing to systemic racism. And maybe I had a hint or an inkling. Maybe I had no idea. And maybe I feel a little guilt about it now that I recognize it. All those things are fine. That's acceptable. People feel like this is terrible because I feel a little guilty. No. If you feel a little guilty, guess what that is? That's a little flame of change waiting for you to fan it and burn all of those terrible, that poor social construct that was fed to you for so long as a child from whoever taught you that you were better than someone else because of the color of your skin. Take that guilt, fan it a little bit, and say, you know what, I can change. I can recognize this is wrong. I can recognize that maybe I made some mistakes about it, and maybe I can't apologize to an individual, but I can make it right in every interaction every day I have with people on the street. If you see something wrong, if you see something that you know, something isn't right. Someone is being treated wrong, unfairly. I mean, and the reaction we've been programmed to have right now is you don't get involved in other people's business. That's the culture we have in America today. It's not my business. Walk away. We can't walk away anymore. It's costing people lives.
No, that's like the conveyor belt I was talking about. Your complacency is just as bad, if because
you either hold people accountable to a level of society you hope to achieve, and you have to do it in a mature, appropriate way. You don't scream at people and threaten them. You have a difficult conversation from a place of empathy. You know what? Like, I understand you're angry, but the way you're doing this right here in public, this isn't right. Talking to that woman that way because she has a different skin color than you isn't right. And maybe you don't think it's because of her skin color, but to everybody else out here watching this situation, that's how it looks. And that's how we are perceiving this situation from the outside looking in. So before you think that your view is the only one that's right, step aside for a second, really evaluate the situation and ask yourself, if all these other people are calling me a name and saying that I did something wrong, maybe I need to look at myself in the mirror and have a conversation. And it might hurt and it might be difficult, but that's how we move forward. We have to lift the tide of individuals if we hope for our society to reach to new levels of interaction and cohesion.
Yeah, well said. Let's Darnell, is there any last thoughts? And Michael, I know you had some stats you wanted to get to. We'll have to put that in maybe for next show. Yeah, for next show. Yeah, Darnell, go ahead, and then I'm going to talk about our guests for our next two shows that we have.
Just to kind of wrap up today's show, so reminding you, we dealt with the events of the week. We dealt with where do we go from here, and we talked about how we can talk about these issues of race. So I want to remind you, viewers, please, I always say this, listen to me. This statement is very important. If you are one of my white brothers and sisters and you are feeling some kind of way, you shouldn't feel some kind of way if you are not racist. Because here's the thing. Whites and blacks and all others are on the same team against the racist. So please don't be upset by experiences that have been brought up, about statistics that have been brought up, news articles that have been brought up. Only reason why you should be upset is if you are not on the team us, or on the team racist.
Yeah, that's well said. Well said, guys. So thanks for coming. A little bit about our next show. We have Aaron Gilbert, who will be on our next show next Wednesday at 7:30. African American. Yeah, a friend of ours, African American individual who we worked with. He's a teacher as well. So we'll be going over things with him as well and getting his insight and input on that. And then the week after that, we have Fran, who is also a friend of ours, and who he will be talking about a little bit about what he does for a living and some of the things that he sees systemically in his field as well. So two really interesting shows coming up. Really appreciate you guys joining us. This will be available to view on live stream on YouTube, not live stream, but on YouTube. All these are recorded, so hopefully right after that. So yeah, God bless. We'll see you guys.
Thanks, everyone.